The courtroom was thick with silence, a silence so dense it felt like the air had been squeezed out of the room, leaving nothing but a heavy weight pressing against every chest, making even the simple act of breathing feel like a task. Every seat was occupied, every eye fixed on the man at the center of it all. The man who sat unmoving in his wheelchair, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw tight, the gleam of polished metals catching the harsh fluorescent light above. Captain James Holloway, 42 years old, decorated, wounded, and battle-hardened, was not here to fight an enemy on some distant battlefield. He was here for Thor, the German shepherd seated by his side, the one soul who had never left him behind, who had never let him fall. To the world, Thor was just another military working dog, a well-trained, obedient creature, a government asset, stamped with a serial number and a service record. But to James, he was something far greater. He was the only constant in a world that had turned cold. He was the partner who had shielded him from bullets, the guardian who had pulled him from the wreckage of an explosion, the companion who had been there when the nightmares took hold and sleep was an impossibility. Thor had been there on the worst nights, the ones where James had stared at himself in the mirror and seen nothing but a broken man staring back. He had sat there, unwavering, when James could not bear to face what had become of his own reflection. And now they wanted to take him away. James tightened his grip on the leash, feeling the worn leather press into his palm, his knuckles white with tension. The judge cleared his throat, the sound crisp and commanding, slicing through the quiet like a knife. "Captain Holloway, this is your final opportunity to speak before the court makes its decision." His voice was even, controlled, devoid of sympathy, but not unkind. He was simply a man upholding the law, but today the law felt cruel, distant, merciless in its rigidity. James swallowed against the lump in his throat. The army had ruled that Thor was government property, and government property could be reassigned. He was not a companion, not a friend, not a soul who had risked his life alongside a soldier. He was an asset, an item, a thing to be inventoried and repurposed. The thought sent a sharp pain through James's chest. Something raw and hollow. After everything they had endured, after all the times they had bled together, survived together, this was how it was supposed to end? Thor being sent off on another mission, as if the past years had been nothing? As if their bond had no weight, no meaning? His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his hold on the leash. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse, thick with emotion he barely managed to suppress. "Your Honor," he began, exhaling shakily before forcing himself to continue. "Thor isn't just a military asset. He saved my life in ways no one here could ever understand." He paused, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of his words, the way they hung in the air, settling over the room like an unseen force. In the field, he pulled me from danger, shielded me from gunfire, and warned me of traps before I even saw him. He put his life on the line for me without hesitation, over and over again. And when I came home, James swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the leash. When I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror, when I felt like I had lost everything, Thor was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. His voice cracked at the end, and for the briefest moment, his composure wavered. "Please," he said, softer now, the words almost a whisper. "Don't take him from me." The silence that followed was absolute. The air was thick, suffocating, heavy with something unsaid. Some of the spectators shifted. Some exchanged glances filled with pity. A few even dabbed at their eyes. Others stared, uncertain, caught between the rigidity of rules and the undeniable weight of the moment unfolding before them. And yet, the judge's expression did not change. His face remained impassive, his hands folded neatly in front of him as he regarded James with unreadable eyes. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he inhaled deeply, leaning forward. He was about to speak. The ruling was coming, the decision that would seal their fate. But before the words could leave his mouth, Thor moved. The dog rose to his feet abruptly, muscles tensed, ears pinned back, his powerful frame shifting like a coiled spring. His leash slipped from James's grasp as he lunged forward, stopping just short of the judge's bench. And then he barked. Not a casual bark, not an uncertain bark, a sharp, commanding, warning bark. The kind that demanded attention, the kind that stopped time. The sound boomed through the courtroom, bouncing off the wooden walls, sending an instant ripple of shock through the crowd. Gasps erupted from the gallery. A bailiff took an instinctive step forward, his hand moving to the weapon on his hip. "Thor!" James called, his voice rising, panic bleeding into the edges of his words. But deep in his gut, he knew. He had seen this before, countless times. This wasn't just barking. This wasn't a random reaction. Thor was alerting, a warning. The murmurs intensified, nervous whispers floating through the room like an unseen current. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone muttered. James's chest tightened. He wheeled himself forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. "He's not just barking," he said, his voice barely above a breath, but firm, certain. "He only does this when there's danger." His throat tightened. "He's trying to warn us." The judge froze. His gavel remained motionless in his grip. His gaze locked onto Thor, watching the way the dog stood, his body rigid, his eyes focused. Not on James, not on the judge, on the courtroom doors, the far end of the room. James's breath caught in his throat. His skin went cold. Thor wasn't looking at him. Thor wasn't barking at the judge. Thor had locked onto something else. James followed his gaze. The heavy wooden doors loomed in the distance, still closed, unmoving. But the weight in James's chest, the cold creeping into his bones, told him everything he needed to know. Thor didn't react to nothing. He never had. And right now, he was reacting. This wasn't just about Thor anymore. Something wasn't right. The air in the courtroom had changed. Gone was the quiet sympathy that had lingered just moments ago, replaced by a slow-building unease that spread through the rows of spectators like a creeping tide. Invisible but undeniable. Whispers rippled through the crowd, hushed voices carrying the undercurrent of something primal. Fear, the kind that didn't come from what was seen, but from the unknown, from the possibility of something lurking just beneath the surface, something waiting to be revealed. The judge's irritation was evident in the sharpness of his voice, the forced authority he injected into each syllable, as if he could rein in the chaos before it truly began. "Captain Holloway, control your dog or I will—" But James didn't let him finish. His own voice, though thick with emotion, cut through the rising tension with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "Your Honor," he said, leaning forward in his wheelchair, gripping Thor's leash so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Thor isn't acting up. He is trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He doesn't react like this for no reason." His chest tightened as his next words came out with absolute conviction. "If he's behaving this way, it means something is seriously wrong." The room stilled, the murmurs fading into a fragile, brittle silence. The weight of James's statement settled over the room like a suffocating fog, the judge's face flickering for just a moment with something almost imperceptible. His fingers twitched where they rested near the gavel, his jaw tightening as he measured his next move, his next words. But before he could speak, before anyone could react, Thor stopped barking. The shift was so sudden, so complete that the absence of sound was almost as jarring as the barking itself. The silence was thick, absolute, unnatural. James felt his heartbeat in his throat as he watched Thor's entire body go rigid, his frame tense as steel, his powerful chest rising and falling in deep, controlled breaths, his muscles locked like a predator that had just caught the scent of something he could not yet see. His ears pricked forward, sharp and precise, attuned to something no one else could hear. And then a low growl rumbled from his chest, a sound so deep it vibrated through the air like distant thunder rolling over a battlefield before the first shot was fired. It was not an uncertain growl, not a response to unfamiliar voices or movement or unease in the crowd. This was different. This was primal. A warning drawn from something older than training, older than instinct itself. James's breath caught, his body stiffened. He knew this growl. He had heard it before. He had heard it just seconds before Thor had uncovered an IED buried in the sand. The memory was visceral, immediate, his mind snapping back to the heat of that moment, the sweat on his back, the blinding sun reflecting off the dust-coated terrain, the stillness in the air before Thor had lunged, barking wildly at a patch of dirt that looked like nothing. James had trusted him without hesitation, had thrown himself backward just in time, had felt the shockwave of the explosion rip through the ground where he had been standing just a second before. That growl had saved his life. That exact growl. And now, Thor was doing it again. James's pulse pounded, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his wheelchair as he followed Thor's line of sight, his breath coming shorter, sharper. The heavy wooden doors at the far end of the courtroom stood closed, unmoving, their thick mahogany surface as ordinary as it had been moments before. And yet, James felt it in his bones. Something was wrong, something was there. He didn't know what, he didn't know how, but Thor did. The room remained suspended in time, every breath held, every movement stalled, as if the walls themselves were waiting. The air had shifted, charged with something electric, something unseen but felt. James didn't move, he barely breathed, because he knew this was bad. The bailiffs hesitated, their unease thick in the air, glancing at each other as if waiting for the other to make the first move. The larger of the two, a broad-shouldered man with wary, calculating eyes, tightened his grip on the baton at his belt, his fingers brushing over the holster of his firearm as if preparing for something he couldn't quite name. His partner, a slimmer but equally tense man, swallowed hard, shifting his weight from foot to foot. There was no reason to be afraid, was there? Just a dog barking, just a courtroom, just a closed door, and yet the tension was suffocating, pressing in on them, growing heavier with every second that Thor remained rigid, unmoving, his deep, guttural growl vibrating through the wooden floors like a warning no one wanted to acknowledge. The larger bailiff exhaled sharply, forcing out a scoff in an attempt to break the silence, but even his own voice sounded uncertain. "It's just a dog, right?" he muttered, his eyes flicking toward the judge, then back at James. "Probably reacting to the noise, the crowd." But James shook his head, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs, his grip tightening on the armrest of his wheelchair. "Oh, Thor doesn't react to nothing. If he's growling like that, there's a reason." The certainty in his voice sent a ripple of unease through the room, and the murmurs died instantly. The judge hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested near the gavel, his lips pressing into a thin line before he finally nodded, though the reluctance in his posture was clear. "Check the hallway." The larger bailiff hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to notice, his jaw tensing as he inhaled slowly through his nose before stepping toward the door. His movements were controlled, calculated, but James could see it. The stiffening of his shoulders, the way his fingers hovered near his holster even though he was trying to appear unaffected. He reached out, gripping the handle. The sound of his fingers closing around the metal seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The entire courtroom held its breath. James could feel his own heartbeat hammering in his chest, his breathing shallow as if his body already knew something was wrong before his mind could even process it. Thor's growl had deepened into something lower, something more primal, his entire body coiled like a spring, ready to lunge. The bailiff turned the handle. The door creaked open. The dim light from the courtroom spilled into the hallway beyond, stretching long shadows against the walls, illuminating the polished tile floor. For a moment, nothing happened. The hallway seemed empty still, just a long corridor leading to the other rooms beyond, nothing but dull light fixtures humming overhead. And then, a sound. A sharp metallic clang from deep within the darkness. Not close, but not far enough. The smaller bailiff jerked violently, his flashlight beam snapping toward the source of the noise, the sudden movement betraying his nerves. The sound echoed, bouncing off the walls, rolling through the space like something heavy had just been shifted, dragged, or dropped. Thor erupted. His barking exploded into the room like a gunshot, booming against the wooden walls, so sudden, so ferocious that several spectators flinched, their gasps overlapping in a chaotic mix of confusion and fear. He lunged forward with everything he had, his nails scraping against the floor as his body strained against the leash, muscles locked, every fiber of him desperate to move. Gasps filled the room. James's grip nearly slipped from the leash, but he held firm, his pulse hammering, his entire body locked in place as adrenaline surged through him. The larger bailiff instinctively drew his weapon, his fingers wrapping around the grip so quickly it was clear he was done pretending this was nothing. "What the hell was that?" His voice was sharp now, tight, his eyes darting between the dark hallway and Thor, as if trying to rationalize what his instincts were already screaming at him. James's throat tightened. His entire body braced itself as he forced his voice to rise above the chaos. "Get Thor back," he shouted. "He's never wrong. Something's coming." The urgency in his voice sent another ripple through the crowd, and suddenly, no one was calm anymore. Spectators shifted in their seats, whispers turning into hurried, panicked conversations, uncertainty spreading like wildfire. And then a single footstep, a slow, deliberate footstep echoing from the darkness of the hallway. Not hurried, not rushed. Measured. Intentional. Thor's growl turned into a snarl, low and dangerous, his teeth bared, his body pushing forward with unrelenting force. James's chest tightened, his breath caught. He knew this feeling, this terrible, suffocating weight in his gut, this moment of absolute stillness before something terrible happened. The larger bailiff's weapon snapped up, his hands tightening around the grip, his stance shifting, every trained muscle in his body preparing. The smaller bailiff's flashlight beam trembled slightly, bouncing as he tried to steady his grip, his breaths coming too fast, his pulse visible in the tightness of his neck. And then, from deep within the darkness, just past the edge of the dim light reaching into the hall, a shadow moved. The footstep was deliberate, landing with a slow, measured weight, the kind of step that belonged to someone with absolute control, someone who wanted to be seen, someone who wasn't afraid. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't rushed. It carried certainty, the confidence of a predator moving through a world of prey. The air in the courtroom seemed to contract, the silence pressing in like a tightening noose, every breath shallow, every heartbeat loud. Thor's barking shifted, no longer the rapid burst of alarm, but a deep, guttural snarl, the sound vibrating through the room, curling around the wooden walls like a physical thing. His muscles bunched beneath his thick coat, his body coiled like a spring, his teeth bared, his growl low, dangerous, unrelenting. Then, a shadow moved. A presence materialized from the darkness of the hallway, not rushed, not hesitant, just there, like it had always been, like it had simply been waiting for its moment. A man stepped forward, his frame tall, broad but lean, his posture unnervingly composed, as if the chaos around him was nothing more than an afterthought. His face remained obscured beneath the deep hood of a heavy coat, the fabric shifting slightly with each step, but never enough to reveal what lay beneath. His hands were tucked deep into his pockets, a calculated move, one designed to test the patience of the men with their fingers hovering near their triggers. He knew exactly what he was doing. His movements were slow, deliberate. Every inch of him exuded a kind of control that sent something cold curling in James's gut, something instinctual, something ancient. This wasn't just a man walking into a courtroom. This was an entrance, a performance, a warning. Thor lunged. His nails scraped against the tile, the sharp sound splitting through the tension like a blade. His body surged forward with all the force of a trained war dog bred to eliminate threats. His eyes locked, his snarling deepening into something vicious, something primal. The leash in James' hands went taut, his fingers straining against the strength of the beast at his side. His entire body braced as Thor pulled with everything he had, his instincts screaming to attack. The bailiffs reacted instantly, their weapons snapping upward, their grips tightening, eyes darting between the lunging dog and the figure who did not flinch. "Who are you?" The larger bailiff's voice was sharp, commanding, the edge of authority cracking just slightly under the weight of the unspoken wrongness that had settled over the room. But the stranger did not answer, he did not slow, he did not even raise his hands in defense. He just kept walking. Another step forward, unfazed, unbothered, unshaken. His face remained mostly hidden, but a flicker of movement beneath the hood revealed something unexpected. A smirk, subtle, barely there, but undeniably real. James's breath hitched, his body went rigid. Something about him felt off, not just threatening, not just dangerous, something worse, something fundamentally wrong. The air in the room was no longer tense. It was suffocating. The spectators sat frozen in their seats, some clutching at the arms of their chairs, others gripping their belongings, as if the mere act of holding something solid would tether them to reality, keep them grounded, keep them safe. But there was no safety here. Not now. Not with him standing there. The man finally moved his hands, slow, calculated, lifting them just slightly from his pockets, enough for the bailiffs to track the movement, enough for everyone to see. Both men on either side of the judge tightened their grips on their weapons, their eyes narrowing, shoulders locking, bodies braced. "Relax." The man's voice cut through the tension like a whisper, laced with something sharp. Calm, even, unshaken, but there was something beneath it, something that felt practiced, like he had said those words before, like he had said them right before doing something terrible. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." The way he said it made the words feel hollow, a sentence spoken simply because it was expected. not because it was true. James's grip tightened on Thor's leash, his nails digging into the leather, his breath slowing, his body instinctively preparing for something he could not yet name but knew was coming. He knew, and Thor did too, because Thor had not stopped snarling, because Thor had not backed down, because Thor had never been wrong. The stranger's hand disappeared into the depths of his coat, his movement slow, controlled, deliberate. Too deliberate. The bailiffs reacted instantly, their training overriding hesitation, their weapons snapping up, fingers tightening around their triggers. "Drop it!" they barked in unison, their voices sharp, cutting through the already fractured air. The command should have frozen him in place, should have made him hesitate, but it didn't. The man stopped, yes. But there was no fear in his posture, no tension in his stance. If anything, the faintest smirk played at the edges of his mouth, barely visible beneath the shadow of his hood, as if the entire situation was unfolding exactly as he had expected. And then, as if he were merely indulging them, he lifted his hand. Metal caught the light, but not in the way they had expected. Not a weapon. A key. Small, unassuming, harmless in any other context, yet in his grip it felt like something else entirely. A message, a promise, a trigger. A fresh wave of unease coiled in James's gut, twisting tight, his every instinct screaming that the shape of this moment had just changed, that whatever was happening, whatever was coming, was no longer just a matter of unease, but of certainty. The stranger rolled the key slowly between his fingers, almost lazy in his movement, as if he were savoring the weight of it, as if he were waiting for the understanding to fully sink in. And then, he murmured, soft enough that it felt personal, but loud enough that everyone in the courtroom heard it. "You'll find out soon enough." James's breath hitched. His body went rigid. And then the key turned. A click. The lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they died. A wave of absolute darkness crashed over the room. Gasps, shouts, the sharp scrape of chairs being shoved backward, of bodies shifting in panic, of people grasping blindly for the edges of desks, for something solid, something real, something safe. But there was nothing safe here. The sound of footsteps in the dark, not rushed, not singular, more than one. Movement that didn't belong to the people scrambling in their seats. Movement that was calm, purposeful, deliberate, closing in. And then the lights flared back to life, the courtroom reeled as vision returned, but the chaos did not subside. Because when the brightness settled, when the world was whole again, the stranger was no longer alone. Behind him, stepping from the depths of the hallway like figures pulled from the void, were two more men, their faces obscured, their presence sharp-edged and wrong, their bodies moving with quiet precision, like they had done this before, like they knew exactly what came next. And unlike the stranger, these men were armed. Their weapons weren't drawn, not yet, but they didn't have to be. The message was clear. They weren't here to spectate, they were here to act. A chill seeped into James's bones, an instinctual kind of dread, the kind that lived somewhere beyond conscious thought, the kind that had saved his life more times than he could count. Thor felt it too, his growl deepened, his lips pulling back further over his teeth. A sound no longer just warning but promise, his body lowering into a stance that spoke of readiness, of violence waiting to be unleashed. The tension had shifted, had thickened into something no longer just about presence, but about what happened next. The bailiffs held their ground, their weapons locked, their expressions tight with barely concealed nerves, their training keeping them rooted, but only just. The room was balanced on a knife's edge, caught between the weight of the unknown and the inevitability of action. A moment stretched too thin. James could feel his pulse hammering, his breath shallower now, his grip tightening so hard on the leash that his fingers ached, but he didn't care, because whatever this was becoming, it had just begun. The story of Captain James Holloway and Thor is more than just a military thriller. It's a profound reflection on loyalty, trust, and the unseen forces that shape our lives. At its core, it teaches us about the power of intuition and the importance of standing firm in the face of uncertainty. Thor, a trained military dog, is not just following orders, he is responding to something deeper, something that logic alone cannot explain. In 2025, as we navigate an increasingly complex world filled with unpredictable challenges, shifting alliances, and unseen threats, this story reminds us that sometimes The most valuable guide we have is our instincts. Like James, we must recognize when something doesn't feel right, whether in business, relationships, or global affairs, and trust our inner voice even when others doubt us. Another lesson woven into this narrative is the unbreakable bond of true partnership. In an age where technology dominates and human connections often feel fleeting, the unwavering loyalty between a soldier and his dog serves as a testament to the kind of trust and dedication that transcends words. Thor doesn't hesitate to act, just as James doesn't hesitate to defend him. This is a lesson in courage and responsibility, in understanding that those who stand by us, whether friends, family, or colleagues, deserve our protection just as they protect us. Finally, the story teaches us about preparedness and vigilance. The enemy does not always announce itself with a bang. Sometimes it moves quietly in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Whether in personal security, leadership, or decision-making, 2025 will demand that we stay aware, adaptable, and unafraid to take action before it's too late. In the end, the world belongs to those who listen, prepare, and stand their ground when it matters most. The battle isn't over. It's just beginning. Captain James Holloway stood his ground, refusing to give up Thor, his loyal military companion, but now he faces an even greater threat. The intruders have revealed themselves, armed and waiting, and we all know one thing. This isn't just about a dog. Something bigger is at play, something lurking beneath the surface. But what should James do next? Should he fight back immediately and risk escalating the situation? Should he play along, gather information, and figure out who these men are before making his next move? Or should he find a way to get Thor to safety first, protecting the one being who has never let him down? We need your help. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. What do you think these intruders really want? What should James do in this high-stakes moment? Do you believe the law will protect him, or is it up to him to take action? What's the best strategy for keeping Thor safe? Your input could shape what happens next. Should James fight, escape, or play the long game? Tell us in the comments and let's uncover the truth together. If you're as hooked as we are, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to follow James and Thor's journey. The fight for justice has just begun, and we want you to be part of it.